Hi, welcome to Bilingualism, Second Language and Literacy Acquisition. This is Module 3, Theories of Language Development and Sequential Bilingualism. My name is Jasmine Alvarado, and I will be the guest lecturer for this module. So let's begin. So the main learning objective for this module is that participants will demonstrate understanding of theories of first and second language development and explore how these theories inform language instruction. Towards the end of this lecture, we will discuss research and claims that point out issues within these theories that are often normalized in the field of second language learning. So before we get into the theories, this is just a quick overview of key terms. So language proficiency under these theories refers to the ability to use a language effectively and appropriately throughout a range of social, academic, and professional life events. And in this graphic, these are components of what makes up and is considered language proficiency / language. So pragmatics refers to the social conventions of language use. Semantics refers to the meaning of language use. And then the other three are specific aspects of language. So phonology refers to systematic rules governing sounds. Morphology refers to the formation of words. So how do parts of words go together to form words? And then syntax refers to the order of words. So once our words are, made up, what's their order in a sentence, for example, or a phrase? So we usually infer cumulative competence based on performance. So the way you apply, rules of language and your knowledge of social conventions, that it is indicative of for a lot of people in society of, your ability to communicate / use language. So first, we're going to discuss first language acquisition theories. And there are three: behaviorist, innatist, and interactionist theory. Then we'll discuss how these three apply to second language acquisition. So in behaviorist theory, the focus of language is verbal behaviors. And under this theory, the claim is that a child will, imitate and practice a specific form of language introduced to them, him or her. And the role of the environment is to model and reinforce. So here's a lot of repetition, modeling from a person, or, it could be from an audio record machine, and then the child would be imitating and responding to the form until they get it right. And even if they get it right, they might want to just keep practicing. So there are issues with this theory. One being that it ignores the creative use of language as we acquire language. And, many of us, when we're learning a language, we just tend to play with it and explore how forms of language work as we learn more about it. So here are a couple examples. I'll give the first, we'll look for this lecture at the first one. It happened automatically. So here, instead of the child repeating it happened automatically, the child put it happened automatically. So here the expectation was just to keep repeating and imitate the correct form, and the child would stop doing that and eventually get to automatically. Also, it doesn't acknowledge the exceptions to general rules of language forms or standardized forms of language. For example, in the English language, we often use to indicate the past tense of a verb, we use ed. However, that doesn't apply to all verbs. And here we can look at the third example. She eated it all up. The child tried to put the ed, implying the general rule of ed for past tense instead of putting ate. So there's no real moment or expectation to be explaining these exceptions under this theory. The second is the innatist theory. And here, the claim is, and Chomsky is a big frontrunner of this theory, that children have this language acquisition device, this like universal grammar in their like brains, and they don't learn grammar per se. It's like they're kind of like scientists, like language scientists, and they are testing like hypothesis about language, like creatively, like trying to figure out language, how it works by testing one possibility, trying it out, see if it works or if it gets the purpose for communication or not, and then they keep revising, correcting themselves. And under this theory, there's like a specific period that's crucial to acquire language. And the specific period is, early childhood stages. So the focus here under this theory is the child syntax. So the way the child places words in a sentence. And the process of acquiring language is, like we mentioned before, testing out forms of language for a specific, social convention / use. And the primary role of the child here is that they're, equipped with this like, internal grammar template, and that they're in a way like these language scientists, like they have a lot of autonomy in playing and, proving and dispelling what they think how language should be used for a specific communicative purpose or context. The role of the environment is more of just like triggering, giving exposure for the child to play with language and not just play, but like hypothesize, test out, that's a better word, test out language and correct themselves based on their findings of from their tests. So Gardner, has put in front for this theory that there are issues regarding not acknowledging the role of parents / caretakers in helping children acquire language, and that adults are needed to help build children's language repertoire and also know the social conventions accompanied with specific forms of language. Now, the third theory under first language acquisition is interactionist theory. And so, as you can probably figure out based on the name, interactionism here involves a lot of the child interacting with the environment. So here the child is like sorting out the conventions and meaning of words gradually through the experiences and interactions with groups and individuals in their communities. And here the focus is a lot about conversations between the child and their care, givers and guardians since they're really young. And, here the process is that, language emerges from communication. The child has an important role in the interaction, but also the environment has an important role in the interaction because it takes two to interact. And here, the caretakers under this theory do modify the input, and they often carry much of the conversation. And as a child acquires more language, or feels more comfortable under a certain situation using specific forms of language, then uh, the load of conversation is more balanced. So before we go into the second language acquisition, I wanted to show you all a video that um, will help you reflect on the nature of language instruction. So here are some questions for you to think about and reflect during and after the viewing. What content did you learn from the first versus second viewing? What language did you think you learned from the first and second viewing? And what adjectives describe how you felt during the viewings? The language here in the video is in Farsi. So those who know Farsi, you'll understand. You'll probably like able to be the purpose, but hopefully many of you, you're not are not too choose Farsi too much, so you can deeply engage with these questions, or those in Farsi can maybe relate to their experiences learning a language and use these questions to think about that. Okay, so I'm going to play the video now.
یکی بود یکی نبود، غیر از خدا هیچ کس نبود. توی شهر دور یک پنگوئن بود و یک اردک. پنگوئن فقط دوست داشت کلا بخوره. غذاشم فقط شکلات بود و آب نبات و چیپس. همیشه سرش درد میکرد، همیشه دلش درد میکرد. توی مدرسه‌ام هیچ شاگرد خوبی نبود و درس نمیتونست بخونه. در عوض اردک فقط آب پرتقال میخورد، سیب دوست داشت بخوره، گلابی میخورد، گندم میخورد و نون رو دوست داشت بخوره. خیلی ورزش میکرد، میدوید، حالش خوب بود. توی مدرسه‌ام خیلی شاگرد خوبی بود.
Now we're going to do the second viewing.
Now I'm going to present to you the same lesson in a different manner. یکی بود یکی نبود، غیر از خدا هیچ کس نبود. تو یک شهر دور یک پنگوئن بود و یک اردک. پنگوئن فقط دوست داشت کلا بخوره. غذاشم فقط شکلات بود و آب نبات و چیپس. پنگوئن همیشه خسته بود، سرش درد میکرد، دلش درد میکرد. توی مدرسه هیچ شاگرد خوبی نبود. وقتی که میشست مدادش رو دست میگرفت، ولی بعد از 2 دقیقه دهن دره میکرد، میگفت سرم درد میکنه. سرش رو میگذاشت روی کتاب و میگفت بهتره چرت بزنم. در عوض اردک همیشه آب پرتقال میخورد، سیب رو خیلی دوست داشت بخوره، گلابی میخورد، نون خوب میخورد، گندم میخورد. همیشه حالش خوب بود، ورزش میکرد، میدوید، هیچ وقتم مریض نمیشد. توی مدرسه هم شاگرد خیلی خوبی بود. مدادش رو دست میگرفت، تند و تند درسش رو میخوند و مینوشت. همیشه توی مدرسه نمره های خیلی خوب داشت، شاگردام همیشه براش دست میزدن.
Okay, so let's review those questions again. What content did you learn from the first versus from the second viewing? What language did you think you learned from the first versus the second viewing? And what adjectives describe how you felt during the viewings? So please use some of your time to reflect on that and think about those implications for the nature of language instruction. Now we're going to move on to second language acquisition and apply those three theories that we just mentioned to learning a second language. And here, the premise from first and second language acquisition is in a way a linear approach to language learning. Here the assumptions are you learn one language, and then you learn a second language or introduced to another language. And we'll discuss that assumption at the end of this lecture. So behavior is perspective, very similar to the behaviorist approach again from first language, but here it's it's applying to the second in second language acquisition. You would see the child or child or person listening, speaking, reading, writing, this type of sequence. And again, it would be like imitation repetition, and they could be learning these structures either from a person, but also you can also see that happening by someone learning a language through audio cassettes, or like for example, or sometimes Rosetta Stone or those type of programs where they have you repeat something and you keep repeating certain grammatical structures, and then with drill and practice embedded in these opportunities. So here, error language errors are expected to be corrected immediately to avoid what is called fossilization. And fossilization under this perspective is the process in which incorrect linguistic features become this permanent part of the way a person uses a new language. So there are specific features that are considered incorrect for the standardized notion of a language, and that just if we don't correct that, it just becomes ingrained into the way a person uses language. Again, these are the theories. This is not aligned to, like specifically aligned to my way of thinking about language, but this is according to this perspective. So again, a lot of here drills, field practice, a lot of grammatical structures, and emphasize a lot of this kind of in terms of instruction, students listens, student speaks, reads and writes after being introduced specific language forms, and imitates and repeats those specific language forms. You often see this type of approach to language in foreign language instruction, or a lot of times heard from former students in their secondary classes when they were students. Okay, when I say students, I mean higher ed students, and so it's like higher ed students reflecting on learning a second language in high school, for example. Okay, let's go to innatist perspective. So here under this perspective, student is learning a second language under what is called like a comprehensible input. So at +1 means like a little bit up, they're acquiring specific language features that are a little bit above the level that they're able to use a second language, that's a little accessible. It's accessible, but it's also rigorous, not too crazy out there in terms of difficulty, slash overwhelming the person to acquire, which doesn't help them acquire those specific features of language. So here also the concern is not really output, but because under this perspective, the student will acquire it naturally, and Under this perspective as well, a silent period is expected. And so it shouldn't be, instructors or people, well, more, yeah, instructors, educators shouldn't worry about someone not producing the language for in the beginning stages, and because they might be, getting all that input of these language features and, sorting this out internally. And once they feel comfortable, they will be able to communicate verbally or express themselves through other modes. Here, errors in relation are not corrected. Students are, expected to correct themselves once they feel comfortable in using/practicing a specific form of language of the second language. So under this perspective here, we have Krashen's monitor model. And so I'm gonna, focus on 3 of these, but we'll just, right now list all of them at first. Acquisition learning hypothesis, monitor hypothesis, natural order hypothesis, input hypothesis, and effective filter hypothesis. So the monitor hypothesis is here that, students are like they're supposed to be acquiring this language, get from like or naturally, and kind of monitoring like how they're using these forms of language and correcting the forms of language that they're practicing/learning. Under the monitor hypothesis, Krashen warns between like the different gives warnings about overuse users versus underusers. So sometimes under this hypothesis, as someone acquiring a language might over monitor, like correct too much the way they're using language, they might not have the enough opportunity to practice the language form. And this is different from an underuser who is like, I'm going to just practice the language, or I'm going to try to just like use the language, but not really being careful of correcting, to self-correcting to make sure they're using this accurate form of language. So under this monitor hypothesis, Krashen's like, we want to get people to this optimal level, that's like this optimal language user that is balanced in practicing language while also self-correcting the new language forms. As we discussed before, there's the input hypothesis, where it's like you're acquiring language, new language forms. It's like a little bit above your comfort level of where you're at in terms of the second language. That is a little, it's rigorous, but not too out there, not too overly challenging or overly complicated that you're not able to pick it up. So we don't, for instruction, you don't want to, like, for example, introduce students like acquiring a second language, like, and who's introducing them like big textbooks or like big chapters, and they're like at the level still of like understanding like the, practicing with more like just a couple of sentences they're able to produce or read and write. Maybe we don't want to like be introducing like these more complex forms of language that are often like chapter books. Lastly, the affective filter hypothesis. Here, the premise is that students' motivation, confidence, and levels of anxiety have a relation with their, their process of learning a second language. So here we want the affective filter ideally to be low, in order for, that means like students is super confidence, has, super motivation and low anxiety, in order to comfortably approach and engage with second language acquisition. So here are some challenges to the Krashen hypotheses. Um, from acquisition learning hypothesis, how do you differentiate conscious to unconscious, natural to what counts as that, and who gets to determine what counts as conscious versus unconscious? Monitor, it's difficult to test empirically, especially like the overuser, underuser, balanced user notion. Here we have a natural order hypothesis, like there's no place under this hypothesis for the how different languages influence each other as you're picking up new forms. So if I know English and I'm learning Spanish, like how do my knowledge of like English influences the way I'm learning and practicing Spanish? So for input hypothesis, it's hard to determine what is exact, like just good, like a rigorous but not overly challenging input of language. And then effective filter hypothesis. Here, the challenge as well, like not everyone who has like a low self-esteem, or has, in a way been traumatized by their schooling, educational experiences, that doesn't mean that they can't acquire or the other language. Often, many times people are so resilient and brilliant that they are able to acquire a second language despite all the difficulties. So that's a challenge. It's not like automatically, oh, your effective filter is high, that means you just can't learn. It's not a self-fulfilling prophecy, and that's a challenge there. So the last one is the interaction and perspective. And here for second language acquisition, it's a lot of negotiation of what words mean, what language means in your interactions with people, groups, communities, etc. And here the natural input comes from your environment. There's no pressure to talk, shouldn't be, and unless it's except for the purpose for communicating. And here errors with language will correct themselves because they often impede your communication. So you will be negotiating the meaning of language in order to get your point across. So here is a table with a summary of the theories and what that looks like for second language acquisition. So we reviewed right now the first and second language theories. And here their underlying premise is that there's this kind of this sequential form of bilingualism where, you learn to become bilingual by acquiring one language after the other. There is another way, though, according to that is aligned with this approach to be bilingual, and that is to become bilingual by acquiring two languages at the same time. And that is referred to often as simultaneous bilingualism. In the following modules, that will be more of the emphasis of learning to be bilingual simultaneously. So you're acquiring two languages at the same time. In this module, the emphasis was more on, learning one languages after the other. Many linguists still in the field of second language acquisition, they believe that up to the age of 4, children are in this, simultaneous acquisition mode. But the children who learn a language like after 5, like another language after 5, then that would be considered more of a sequential bilingualism. So children exposed to 2 languages up to the age of 4, that would be considered simultaneous, and those that are exposed to another language after from 5 would be sequential. I'm not sure if I said simultaneous in the beginning, but yes, up to 4 simultaneous, and then after 5, if you're exposed to a second language, you'd be sequential. So here are the two forms of bilingualism, and in the following slide, we'll unpack right now some related myths to sequential bilingualism. So there are two big very common myths. The earlier a language is acquired, the more fluent a child will be in it. Actually, children are not less embarrassed or don't have, fewer, like in it, don't have fewer inhibitions as they, get older. It doesn't mean that they're like, oh, like it will, are more like brave or like, excuse me, younger was like it, they're braver, like can be still like very intimidated by acquiring a language. It's like just assume here this myth assumes a lot of like the way the child engages with language in terms of not being like nervous or embarrassed or willing to learn language later, like after the age of 5. And then in the other myth is the brain is more malleable very early and is more receptive to tasks such as language learning. A lot of linguists now in the field, they say that the notion of a strict critical period for language learning that was supposedly around 5 years old has now been replaced with a broader sensitive period that can extend beyond 10 years old and is very different for children based on what, how and what they know about language. So these are two often like general myths that are that they are present in schools and communities. So here's another critique up to the premise of / theories of second language acquisition. From the Flores and Rosa article, they specifically bring the approaches to race and racialization in language learning. And they propose a shift from focus in second language acquisition research on what students do with language, specifically students from racialized minoritized backgrounds, to how they're perceived, how their languages like build institutions, people, entities to that. Like we should shift the focus on how the entities that perceive them, those interpretations. So this is called a white listening subject. And often the misconception is that a white listening subject has to be a person. No, it can be, this represents an entity, an artifact, an institution, a thing that interprets and makes assumptions or decisions on the language practices of groups or individuals. So under this article, Flores and Rosa, they consider how language users' intentions may be overdetermined as inappropriate or inadequate by their interlocutors because of their racialized position. So this means that interlocutor, and this again could be a person, institution, artifact, entity, the perceiver, that they determine, the way like they classify language use of a person as inappropriate based on their positionings, specific racialized, minoritized positioning in society. And so this would be compared to, let's say, the language, if someone who was from a white upper social class background using the same language use, the interlocutor under this premise would be interpreting that language form as adequate, as ideal, even though it's the same thing, same feature as the ones that are used in racially minoritized communities. So this issue stems from the long history of colonization, colonialism that has been entrenched and continues to be in schools, institutions, and across society. And that they claim that we have to reconcile and negotiate how these histories intersect with how language use is perceived in society, specifically the language use of racially minoritized groups. So with regard to cognitive approaches to language, they assert that we need to take into account how the experience / legacy of colonialism continues to inform the cognitive processes of people and the way that we, interpret / perceive language, and consider what counts as proficient, what is count as idealized language. And lastly, they advocate for learning about how language has played a key role in bundling certain language features as sets associated with specific groups of people or specific forms of legitimate being in the world. So for this module, in your activity, you will be, reviewing the theories as well as engaging with the claims from Flores and Rosa in conversation with the aforementioned theories. Well, good luck finishing the activity and take care.